Hi there! Welcome to Explain This, a podcast where we try to explain complex things in simpler ways for people of all ages. I'm your host Jin Kim, and today we delve into yet another chemical vice of humanity. We've covered alcohol in episode 12 and caffeine in episode 32, so now we cover the most dangerous yet common vice.
Okay.
Let's face it, it's 2023, and no matter what old Joe the sunglass-toting propaganda espousing camel says, smoking is not cool anymore. Smoking, specifically cigarettes and other tobacco products such as cigars and hookahs, is the number one cause of preventable disease in the developed world. We have robust evidence from over a century and a half of scientific data of how smoking kills people in all sorts of horrible ways, and even when it doesn't kill, it can cause significant harm and disability, especially to all the poor non-smokers who are involuntarily exposed to second-hand smoke. Because remember, medicine teaches us that what doesn't kill you doesn't make you stronger, it just maims you and reduces your quality of life. And yet, 22.3% of the world's population still smokes tobacco as of 2020. That's more than 1 in 5 people using a substance that will actively shorten their lifespan by 10 to 18 years, and about half of those people will die from a smoking-related disease instead of living out a natural life. You've probably got at least one person in your life who has or currently smokes, so this isn't just some distant issue either. And if you know someone who is a smoker, you've probably heard them say at least once just how hard they find it to quit. People make comments like how quitting smoking is harder than quitting hard drugs, such as heroin or cocaine. So the big question is, why? Why do people smoke? Why is tobacco so deadly? And why do people find it so hard to quit this habit even when they detest it and want to get healthier? Today we're going to break down this prevalent toxic substance, the history of tobacco, all the different ways it can kill you, and in general, why you shouldn't smoke. Or at least why you should quit while you're ahead if you are a smoker. We'll also briefly talk about the new rising concern, e-cigarettes, or vapes. First of all, let's explain to you why smoking tobacco is so dangerous as if you were a child. Imagine that your body is like a colorful, marvelous garden that your mum and dad spend every Saturday morning maintaining to keep it beautiful. Each part of the garden is made up of different kinds of flowers or trees, but they all need to be watered regularly and have enough clean air to breathe. Well, if you've watched enough cartoons or movies, you know that whenever we start with an imagine a beautiful garden in a paradise, some baddie like Bowser is trying to do evil, nasty stuff to it to turn it into a toxic wasteland like Mordor. In our story, the baddie is cigarettes. You see, cigarettes are rolled up tobacco leaves that are burned so people can breathe in the smoke because it gives them a rush of a feeling. But unfortunately, what they're breathing in is literally poisonous. Firstly, when you burn tobacco, it makes a sticky black icky goo called tar. You know how when your dad accidentally burns the sausage in the barbecue, the black char tastes really bitter and yucky? Tar is very similar. Burnt stuff can be really bad for the body. Imagine that you take a bucket of black sticky slime and pour it all over your pretty garden. What do you think will happen? Well, first of all, your parents are going to get real mad at you, but other than that, the flowers are going to clump and stick to the ground, and they'll wither and die because the tar itself is toxic. It's going to make the ground all sticky, so it's hard for you to walk around the garden and trim the trees or pick up any litter that ended up in the garden. And the once plush, springy, fresh grass is going to end up all dry, straw-like, so it'll be sharp and uncomfortable to play on barefoot. This is exactly what happens in your lungs, where the smoke goes to after you inhale cigarette smoke. The tar sticks in the teeny tiny balloons that provide you oxygen, breaking the elastic bands in them and making them all floppy like a plastic bag. It sticks to all the fine hairs along your lungs that act as the cleaner, so you can't get all the germs and gunk and all the other bad stuff in your lungs out. That's why your uncle who smokes a lot always sounds gross with all his hacking and coughing and spitting up black phlegm. But it gets worse, because tobacco has a sneaky chemical called nicotine. It puts a spell on your brain to trick it into really wanting more nicotine. So even though you can see your garden getting dirtier and deader, you can't stop yourself pouring in more tar in the garden. Eventually, all the tar buildup kills your lungs, making every single breath really difficult, and making it really easy for you to get bad chest infections. It's like you're drowning every minute of being awake, which is an awful way to live. And that's not all. The toxic tar constantly damages your lungs, and while your body is pretty good at healing itself, if it has to do it over and over and over again, it can make mistakes, and the new lung cells might not know how to restrain itself. So, just like that time your mum accidentally left a cookie jar unattended, the lung cells show no self-control, eat all the cookies, keep growing, and eventually becomes cancer, which eats away at the rest of the body and kills you. Not fun. And the lungs aren't the only garden to be affected. All the gardens or organs in your body are connected by blood. And because the lungs are the organs that deliver oxygen to the blood, all the cigarette smoke and the nasty poisons get transported all around the body to poison the rest of it. This makes your blood vessels harden to cause heart attacks, blindness, and rotting hands and feet. It can cause cancer in pretty much anywhere in your body, and it can make you easily break your bones or not be able to have kids when you're older. And that's not even mentioning the terrible breath and gnarly yellow teeth you'll have from smoking. And you're not going to have any pocket money left over to buy snacks or treats because smoking is a really expensive addiction. So, all in all, there's really nothing good about smoking. Welcome back. So, we're not going to beat around the bush today. Smoking kills, and there's absolutely no good reason that anyone should start smoking, or they shouldn't make efforts to quit smoking. At the same time, nothing in the world is as easy as people shouldn't do this, problem solved. So to better understand why smoking is so prevalent despite the apparent dangers and harm associated with it, we're going to start the podcast by learning about the history of tobacco and how tobacco works. Also, for simplicity's sake, we're going to use either smoking or tobacco when talking about all of the different kinds of tobacco-related products, including cigarettes, cigars, and hookah, because they all have very similar compounds within them, and the harm they cause are all similar as well. We'll get to that. Tobacco is a plant that originates from America, so at least in Europe and Asia, it's only been a part of history for about 500 years. Before the introduction of tobacco, people still smoked various things such as cannabis, opium, and various hallucinogenic drugs since the Bronze Ages. These were used either recreationally or more commonly for religious rituals where shamans would get high to have spiritual visions and be under the influence while performing ceremonies. They were also sometimes used medicinally, such as for pain relief. In the Americas, there is evidence of tobacco being smoked even 12,000 years ago, so it's not that new to humanity. Anyway, tobacco was introduced to the so-called Old World of Europe by Christopher Columbus and the Spanish around 1528, when they returned from their colonial expeditions to the Americas. Oh yes, yet another evil born out of the Columbian Exchange. Because these sailors had met Native Americans smoking tobacco in pipes, they already knew that smoking tobacco produced a mild euphoria and rush feeling that helped people combat fatigue. They found this fascinating, and many Spaniards picked up the habit there and decided to bring the plants back to continue their smoking habit. Initially, people pushed back on tobacco and thought it was an unnecessary vice. The smoke from the tobacco plant was foul-smelling, they could see it had some effect on the minds of the smokers, and overall, it just seemed all very unpleasant. There's a great document by King James I of England who wrote A Counterblast to Tobacco in 1604, denouncing it by saying that it's, quote, loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. So it's interesting that right from the get-go, some people understood how dangerous this plant might be. Nevertheless, tobacco quickly grew in popularity with more and more people trying it out and becoming addicted to the plant. Doctors and scientists were fascinated by the tobacco plant, studying whether it had value as a pain relief medication, but also attempting to use it as a sort of panacea, or cure-all. Fun fact, tobacco was introduced to France by an ambassador named Jean Nicot, and he gave the plant the genus name Nicotiana, after his surname, and that's where the word nicotine comes from. The word cigarette is also a French word, denoting that it's a much smaller version of the cigar. Anyway, by the 19th century, tobacco was seeing widespread use and production, with it becoming more and more socially acceptable to be a smoker. Tobacco was consumed in various ways. Smoking it in a pipe was quite common, and cigars and cigarettes, where the dried tobacco leaves would be rolled up with thin paper, were becoming increasingly popular. There were also cigarillos and hookahs and chewing tobacco. It also spread from Europe to the rest of the world, such as the Ottoman Empire and Asia, through trade and missionaries. Now, by this point, it was already becoming evident that this vice came with downsides. There are many people noting that smoking tobacco resulted in negative effects such as fatigue, dizziness, reduced senses, and halitosis. That's bad breath in fancy medical words. By the late 19th century, More and more doctors and researchers were voicing concerns that smoking might also be associated with more serious diseases. We can see terms such as coffin nails being used to describe cigarettes become more common around then as well. At this point, the automated cigarette-making machines and widespread aggressive marketing by tobacco companies meant that quite a significant proportion of society were smoking, and more women were starting to smoke as well, with it becoming more socially acceptable. The 1910s is when the first papers highlighting the link between smoking and lung cancer, as well as smoking and early death, started coming out of Germany. Doctors had noticed and were increasingly reporting more association between smoking and mouth cancers, lung cancers, and vascular diseases such as gangrene. In 1930, a meta-analysis, a study that studies lots of other studies to pool the data together for more statistical strength, concluded that yes, tobacco use causes cancer. Interestingly, the first modern country to ever formally ban tobacco was Nazi Germany. That's right, the government actually took heed of the German doctors' warnings and banned it outright in 1941. So yeah, even Hitler was against smoking. But even with these preliminary warning signs from scientific literature, the number of smokers grew, with more and more people picking up the addiction. People ignoring hard scientific data and public health warnings? That hits close to home, huh? Anyway, in 1948, Richard Dole published the first major study that smoking could cause lung cancer, showing that there was a 20-year lag between smoking and the occurrence of lung cancer. I'll include the graph in the show notes because it's fascinating. You can see how as the number of smokers rises, you can see that exact same trend duplicated 20 years later in the number of lung cancer patients. But did this stop people? Oh no, governments still weren't regulating tobacco use, people didn't believe the scientists, and tobacco companies advertised and lobbied even harder to make sure they could milk more money out of consumers. Over the 1950s and 60s, countless papers were published to further build upon this huge body of research supporting the theory that smoking causes not only cancer, but a host of other illnesses such as heart attacks, diabetes, gangrene, and emphysema. The biggest of all of these studies was the British Doctor Study, studying 40,000 doctors since 1951 all the way till 2001. All of these studies backed up the fact that this was not just correlation, but causation. By the 1960s, the academic and medical community were widely accepting of this theory and voiced concerns of how we've allowed a seriously harmful substance take over society and result in millions of unnecessary young deaths. But it took another few decades before governments properly started combating tobacco, placing warnings on packaging, banning advertisements, putting a minimum age on buying cigarettes, etc. So, there you go. The history of tobacco shows that even when we know for sure something is dangerous, it can take a frighteningly long period of time and millions of deaths before society responds positively and takes large-scale action to combat it. That said, thanks to the dedication of these researchers and advocates, we now live in an age where smoking rates are reducing year by year. The general population understands and has the opinion that smoking is deadly and a filthy habit, and more smoke-free campaigns are taking foothold to reduce the harmful effects of tobacco. So, we keep talking about how tobacco is dangerous, but why and how is it so dangerous? Tobacco is the main ingredient in cigarettes, cigars, and hookah. When someone says that they smoke, it usually is referring to tobacco. As you know by now, tobacco is a plant indigenous to North and South America. It's from a family of plants called the nightshades, which includes other dangerous and toxic plants such as the deadly nightshade, but also less harmful plants like potatoes and tomatoes. Side note, potatoes can be poisonous as well if they're turning green after being exposed to light for so long. This is because of an alkaloid, or plant poison, called solanine. Anyway, back to tobacco. The leaves of the tobacco plant are dried, then shredded to make up the active ingredient that people smoke. This might be in the form of using a pipe, where the leaves are directly burned, or in the form of a cigarette or cigar, where the leaves are packaged in thin paper so that it burns with the tobacco. Cigarettes often contain a few other additives as well, such as flavoring to enhance the smell and taste, ammonia salts to increase the effect of nicotine, and things like propylene glycol as a preservative. But for the most part, tobacco is just tobacco. Which means, for our purposes, it keeps things simple because we can just talk about one ingredient when discussing why people smoke and why it's so bad. Let's start with the chemical in tobacco that everybody knows about. Like the other nightshades, tobacco also contains many different chemicals, or alkaloids. One of these is the infamous nicotine. Nicotine is produced by plants to act as a pesticide. It's deadly to insects because it acts as a neurotoxin, or nerve gas essentially. Remember how in our episode about general anesthesia we talked about neurotransmitters? Well, nicotine happens to look very similar to acetylcholine, one of the major neurotransmitters. In insects, the nicotine can disrupt their nervous system enough to kill them. In humans, however, nicotine is rarely fatal. In fact, nicotine is the main reason people smoke. When nicotine binds to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the nerves, it causes a few different things. Firstly, nicotine acts as a stimulant, or an upper. So, similar to other uppers like caffeine and amphetamines, it triggers the sympathetic nervous system and the release of adrenaline. This raises the heart rate, blood pressure, and your breathing rate, while making people feel more heightened and alert, kind of like when you're psyching yourself up before asking someone out on a date. On top of this, nicotine binds directly to the neurons in the brain as well. Here, it seems to tickle the brain in just the right way to create a sense of euphoria, or a bit of a buzz, by releasing dopamine and endorphins. Luckily, outside of these two things, nicotine doesn't do that much else. It's not a strong stimulant, so unlike caffeine, it doesn't seem to increase your blood pressure to the point of causing heart disease or anything like that. So what are we so worried about if nicotine isn't dangerous? Well, just because nicotine isn't toxic to us, it doesn't make it any less dangerous. The real danger of nicotine is what it does to the brain. Specifically, it makes the brain into a groveling slave. Because of how it triggers the dopamine release, your brain really wants more nicotine after it's had some. It just wants one more hit. We see this in all sorts of different addictive things, such as gambling, alcohol, and meth. Because dopamine is what the brain uses to reward good behavior, like giving a good dog a treat, when a chemical hijacks the system, the brain is like, oh yes, give me more of that. And turns out, nicotine is super addictive. I'm talking more addictive than caffeine, alcohol, cannabis, and even cocaine and heroin. And the problem is, it's so addictive that people find it really hard to quit smoking. And this is dangerous because even though nicotine isn't toxic, a whole bunch of other stuff in tobacco is. We'll talk a little bit more about nicotine later in the episode, but for now, all you need to know is that nicotine is a mild stimulant. It's not super toxic, but it is incredibly addictive. So, let's talk about the other stuff in tobacco that will kill you. Especially because once you start smoking, it's super hard to quit due to nicotine having a leash around your neck. Like I said, most people consume tobacco in the form of smoking it. Whether it's a pipe, cigarette, or even a hookah or bong, which uses water vapor instead of direct smoke, it involves the combustion of tobacco. And this is where the problems come from. Burning. When you burn organic matter, such as food, it can create some nasty stuff. This is why burnt food tastes bad. Your taste buds are trained to say, yuck, bitter is bad, spit it out. In the case of tobacco, burning it to smoke it releases a substance called tar. Now, this isn't the same tar that you find in asphalt, but it's not too far different in terms of how bad it is for you. Tobacco tar is a dark brown sticky substance that just looks like it shouldn't go into your body. It's a very dark brown to black, oily looking substance that clings and sticks, making it super hard to clean. This means that when you breathe in cigarette smoke, you're coating the insides of your lungs with the sticky substance. We'll talk more about why this is bad in the next section. It can also stick to your teeth to blacken and rot it, damaging your gums, killing your taste buds. But it doesn't just look disgusting and sickening, it's literally toxic as well. Here are some of the chemicals in tar. See if you recognize any of them. Carbon monoxide, the stuff you have detectors for to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning, also found in car exhaust fumes. Ammonia, used for household cleaning and excreted by your body actively in urine because it's bad for you. Formaldehyde, used as embalming fluid in preserving dead animals and plants. Lead, cadmium, acetone, acetaldehyde, the toxic compound that alcohol turns into to make you feel sick and cause liver cancer. Arsenic and cyanide, poisons commonly used to kill people in murder mysteries. On top of these, tar contains more than 30 different carcinogens, or chemicals that we know cause cancer. These compounds, such as acrolein and benzopyrene and other chemicals with long chemical names such as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, are mostly the product of burning tobacco. Which is important to note because for a long time, people would say things like, oh, tobacco can't be harmful, it's natural. And we can't find any harmful chemicals in the tobacco plant, it must be safe. Yeah, you know what else is natural? Poisons. Specifically designed to kill other natural things. Because nature is metal like that. You even hear people talking about, oh, the chemical's also in food, it's been rated as safe to consume by the authorities. But neglect to point out that when these safety ratings are given out, it's specifically referring to what happens when you ingest or eat the thing, not smoking and breathing it in, which causes the chemicals to be absorbed much more rapidly and readily into your bloodstream. Anyway, because tar is so sticky and viscous, all of these nasty, horrid chemicals stick down in your lungs, making it harder for your body to get rid of them, which means it just keeps poisoning you over and over, slowly killing you over decades, sapping away your life from inside. On that happy note, let's take a short break. When we're back, we'll talk specifically why the chemicals in tobacco tar are dangerous, and how smoking causes specific kinds of deadly illnesses, such as COPD, lung cancer, heart attacks, and erectile dysfunction. Huh? Oh, yeah, that's a major and common side effect of smoking. Not deadly, but you might want to know a little bit more about that when someone offers you a cigarette. Welcome back. Alright, so now we get to the nitty-gritty of exactly how cigarette smoking kills. We've already talked about what is inside tobacco that makes it so terrible. Sticky tar that gunks up whatever it sticks to, toxic deadly poisonous chemicals in the tar, and nicotine that keeps you addicted so that you smoke more and more of these deadly cigarettes. We know from extensive research and vast amounts of data that smoking damages almost every organ in the body and causes a colossal amount of disability and death all around the world. It's estimated that about 6 million people die each year around the world from smoking-related causes. That's not just 6 million smokers dying of any cause. That's 6 million people dying due to an illness caused by smoking, which they wouldn't have died from if they hadn't smoked. Even worse than that, 10% of that number, 600,000 people, die from smoking-related causes from second-hand smoke. That means these people were not even smokers, but suffered death and disability due to the actions of other people around them. Like I said, smokers have an overall life expectancy 10 to 18 years fewer than non-smokers, and half the people who smoke will end up dying from smoking-related complications. So yeah, it's a pretty darn serious issue. The World Health Organization has labeled tobacco use as the single greatest cause of preventable death globally. That means eradicating tobacco would do more for the health of humanity than eradicating malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV combined. Twice over, in fact. Smoking causes damage to the human body in various creative ways. Let's start with the most obvious organ that gets affected by smoking, the lungs. The poor lungs really get the brunt of the damage from smoking tobacco, because the lungs are where all that inhaled smoke ends up in first. If you ask people, how does smoking kill? Most people would first think of lung cancer. And there's a good reason why. We've talked about how in the early 20th century, doctors pointed out the huge jump in lung cancer rates that correlated to the rise in the number of smokers 20 years before that. The evidence piled up more and more to show that this wasn't just a correlation, but a direct causation. And now, we know why. As I mentioned before, tobacco tar contains lots of nasty chemicals like the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, acrolein, nitrosamines, and acetaldehyde. These chemicals are what we call carcinogens, a chemical that is known to directly cause cancer in cells. Quick recap on what cancer is. Our cells are wonderful biological factories, but that have the amazing ability to grow and divide and multiply, so that we have constantly generated new healthy cells, especially after we've been injured or fallen ill. But if a cell grows and grows without restriction, it'll be problematic. For one, you'd look like a meaty, Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. So the body has a fail-safe kill switch in every cell. When a cell is getting too big and it's writing checks its body can't cash, or if it's breaking down, or if there's a fault with its instruction manual, the DNA, another cell will come and put it to sleep, shall we say. And by put it to sleep, I mean tell it to literally kill itself, in a process called apoptosis. The cell activates its own self-destruct button and basically implodes and bursts. This lets the body regulate the number of cells and prevents one group of cells growing too much and taking too many resources, upsetting the delicate balance and harmony. But sometimes a cell will have a malfunction in just the right way, where it forgets where its self-destruct button is. Or it might go rogue and not listen to the rest of the body, deciding to follow its own path, like all the self-help Instagrammers are saying. This cell will keep multiplying and growing, putting out more blood vessels to steal more sugar and oxygen, taking up more space and invading its neighbors, much like a greedy nationalistic empire would. This is cancer. Eventually, bits of the cancer can break off into splinter cells, setting up their own cancer countries nearby, or even hitching a ride in the bloodstream or lymphatic system to spread to other parts of the body, which is what metastasis is. Alright, so back to smoking and carcinogens. The carcinogens in cigarette smoke directly damage the lung cells' DNA. Because DNA is what cells need to function, cells don't like having their DNA broken. So it has its own cleanup crew that keeps checking DNA and repairing it, like a dedicated Wikipedia editor removing all incorrect information. But if a cell has to do this over and over and over, it's eventually going to make a mistake. Instead of filling in the broken DNA with the correct bits of information, it might make a substitution by error. Or it might stitch together two wrong ends, completely changing how the DNA reads, like a book with the pages bound in the wrong order. This is what genetic mutation is, and for the most part, many mutations are harmless because it just reads as gibberish and the cell ignores it. But some mutations are subtle enough that it alters the cell's functions and the proteins it produces just a little bit. When these mutations build up, it can lead to a situation where the cell can no longer regulate itself, and it becomes cancer and gorges on everything around it. So, the more carcinogens a cell is exposed to, and the more frequency it's exposed to it, the higher the risk of a cancer developing. And that's even with the body's automatic anti-cancer systems all in place. And this is why we see that 20-year lag between smoking and lung cancer development. It takes time for these mutations to build up, and for these cancer cells to grow big enough to be detectable, or to be causing enough problems in the body, like blocking off key airways and collapsing your lung, rupturing the shoddy blood vessels it's laying down and bleeding into your lungs, or spreading to other important organs like the brain, or bones, or liver, and shutting them down. Oh, and it's not just the chemical carcinogens in cigarettes that causes lung cancer. Did you know that cigarettes are also radioactive? Yep, cigarette smoke contains two radioactive elements, polonium-210 and lead-210. You might recognize polonium as the radioactive poison used by the Russian intelligence service to assassinate Alexander Litvinenko to silence him. Radiation causes cancer in a very similar way to chemical carcinogens. The high-energy radiation blasts through a cell's DNA and damages it. As more damage builds up, the more the cell has to try to repair it, and eventually, enough mutations build up that cancer forms. If you smoke 1.5 packs of cigarettes a day, you're receiving the radiation dose of 60 to 160 millisieverts a year, which is about 20 to 50 times the radiation a regular person receives on average. For comparison, getting a CT scan equates to receiving just 7 millisieverts, while living near a nuclear power plant exposes you to 0.0001 millisievert per year. So yeah, if you're worried about radiation from X-rays and CT scans and nuclear power plants, smoking is so much worse than that. And even worse, remember how we talked about cigarette tar being sticky? This means that these toxic carcinogens and radioactive particles cling to the inside of your lungs' airways and alveoli, continuously poisoning the lungs over years. The carcinogens also get into the bloodstream, which is why tobacco raises your cancer risk for pretty much all cancers. Specifically, smoking can cause cancer in the lungs, the mouth, the larynx or voice box, pancreas, bladder, colon, kidneys, liver, esophagus, ureter, cervix, and even blood cancers such as acute myeloid leukemia. Yep, smoking sucks donkey butt. To highlight how cancer-inducing smoking is, consider these statistics. Smokers are 25 times more likely than non-smokers to develop lung cancer. Smoking causes 80% of all lung cancer deaths in women and 90% in men. If no one smoked, 1 in 3 cancer deaths in the USA would not happen, and probably a similar rate for all other countries. Before World War I, lung cancer was such a rare diagnosis that many doctors would never see a single case of it during their career. Nowadays, we diagnose it in people in their 30s frequently. I've lost count of the amount of times a young smoker coughing up blood came to my emergency department, and the chest x-ray would just confirm my fears, and for the patients to receive a terminal diagnosis. I really can't overstate just how bad smoking and tobacco are. If you've had anyone in your life go through cancer, whether they survived it or died from it, you'll know how it can drastically reduce a person's quality of life and bring a sudden grinding halt to everything. So yeah, please don't smoke if you never have. And if you do, the earlier you quit, the more you can reduce the harmful effects of getting cancer. And if you're still not convinced, let me tell you about another very common consequence of smoking, the everlasting breathlessness and feeling of death known as COPD. You might not have heard about COPD, but I'm sure you've heard of emphysema. To be honest, as a doctor, instead of telling people about lung cancer being the reason to quit smoking, I talk about COPD more often. If you've listened to episode 34, you'll remember how lungs work. To summarize, your lungs are shaped like a tree. The trunk and branches are the airways, hollow tubes that carry the air that you breathe in and out. These airways divide and divide and divide into smaller airways, branching out like a big tree, until they end in alveoli. The alveoli, essentially the leaves of the lung tree, are teeny tiny elastic balloons. When they inflate with the air that is sucked in as you breathe in and puff out your chest, they suck out the oxygen from the air and pass it onto the bloodstream, so your heart can deliver that sweet, sweet oxygen to the rest of your body. It also removes the carbon dioxide from the blood. As you relax your breath and breathe out, the elastic alveoli contract, like an inflated balloon being let go. This squeezes the carbon dioxide-filled air out of the lungs, and you breathe it out. Now, what happens when instead of fresh air, you're sucking in dirty cigarette smoke into your lungs? The sticky tar coat all of the airways that it touches, clinging and clogging it down. This can cause blockages, meaning that the alveoli past them won't get any oxygen, and you'll essentially be breathing with less lung. The tar coating the airways cause another problem, which is that the cilia can't function anymore. You know how when you breathe in dust or accidentally have water go down the wrong pipe, you have a hacking cough? That's because the lungs hate anything other than air being in your airways, because you could die. So it tries to cough out the big pieces, but it can't be coughing all the time, so it's got a more civilized waste disposal system, the cilia. These are teeny tiny hairs that coat the inside of your airways, that beat side to side like they're at a concert. The cilia move mucus and all the gunk like dust and dirt and pollen and stuff like that got into your lungs, transports it all the way up the airways like a conveyor belt, until it dumps it into your throat so you can spit it out or swallow it. But if your airways are coated in sticky tar, it would be like if you poured sticky soda all over your hair. It would mat and stick, meaning the hairs wouldn't be able to beat and move. So your lungs lose the ability to transport the gross stuff out of your lungs, including the tar and the other dirty particles from the smoke. This is why smokers have that nasty smoker's cough, because the cilia can't do the job. More and more secretions build up in their lungs, plugging the precious airways, and the only way they can get rid of it is coughing it up and spitting it out. And remember that tar isn't just sticky, but it's also toxic. It directly damages the delicate smooth muscle cells in your airway, causing inflammation, much like having a bad cold or an asthma attack. But unlike a cold that gets better after a week, if you're addicted and smoke every day, your lungs will be chronically inflamed. Chronic inflammation is especially bad because the body doesn't know what to do with it, so it just slaps a whole bunch of scar tissue over the inflammation. A lot of healthy cells die in the inflammation as well, releasing inflammation secretions, which builds up even more in the lungs due to the cilia being coated in tar. The end result of all of this mess is something called chronic bronchitis, where the lungs are producing too much mucus and the airways are all swollen and weak from the inflammation. On top of this, you have emphysema, where your alveoli are also damaged by the tar. The constant inflammation in scar tissue destroys the fine elastic tissues in your alveoli and small airways. This means your lungs, which are normally super soft, squishy, springy sponges, become floppy, crinkly, rustling plastic bags with no elasticity. Similar to that one pair of pajama pants that you've worn too much and there's no elastic left, so it just falls down when you stand up. Because you need elasticity for your lungs to contract when you breathe out, the longer you smoke and the more emphysema that builds up, the less you're able to breathe air out. This causes gas trapping, and your lungs can't breathe in new air as well because it's already full of stale old air that you couldn't breathe out. The combination of emphysema and chronic bronchitis is what's known as COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. In a simple way, it's like having a chronic asthma attack permanently, with irreversible damage and inflammation that can't be settled even with medications. It's a horrible disease because the lungs just progressively get baggier and floppier and more inflamed, which also predisposes you to getting chest infections easier, and also suffering a lot more every time you have a respiratory infection. Eventually, the lungs become so damaged by the COPD that people can't even walk to their mailbox, or they need to be on oxygen 24/7 just to stay alive. And even then, the whole time they feel like they're not getting enough air, and often feeling like they're drowning due to the trapped secretions. About 20% of all smokers get COPD, and about 50% of heavy smokers will develop it. It's almost exclusively a smoker's disease as well, with 80 to 95% of all COPD patients being current or ex-smokers. There are some rare conditions such as alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency that can cause it, but for the most part, it's a super preventable disease as long as you don't smoke. And remember, it's not just the lungs that get affected by tobacco. We've already talked about the carcinogens being transported by the bloodstream to all the other organs. The noxious chemicals such as formaldehyde and ammonia and arsenic, along with free radicals that cause oxidative damage, trigger inflammation in the blood vessels as well. This makes the inside of the blood vessels all roughened, and the vessels become more predisposed to atherosclerosis, which is when you get hard, fatty plaques building up. These plaques can burst and clot off, blocking off important arteries. This is what commonly causes vascular diseases such as heart attacks, strokes, and gangrene, all of which you can die from, and even if you survive, you'll have permanent disabilities such as not being able to move one side of your body forever, or having to have an amputation. Oh, and this kind of damage to your blood vessels is also what can cause erectile dysfunction in men who smoke. Turns out that when you smoke, you have an 85% increased risk of not being able to pop an erection, even if you're relatively young. So, don't think of all these nasty things will only happen to you when you're older. Smoking can ruin the fun you have at any time. And we haven't even mentioned things like rotting gums, possibly going blind from retinopathy or cataracts, developing diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis, getting osteoporosis and breaking your hip prematurely, or going infertile. The worst part of it all is that these consequences don't only affect the people who smoke. It affects everyone around them. Like I mentioned before, non-smokers account for 10% of all deaths attributed to smoking, because of secondhand smoke. The smoke that smokers exhale still contain plenty of tar and carcinogens, and they can be even more dangerous than the initially inhaled smoke, because it's cooler and the burnt chemicals have had more time to develop. We also know that smoking is really bad in pregnancy. It significantly increases the risk of miscarriages, premature birth, and low birth weight, while potentially tripling the risk of babies dying from sudden infant death syndrome. So the big question is it worth it? The world is a pretty damn interesting place, with all kinds of different ways to enjoy life, like food, experiences, social connections, or even significantly less harmful vices like a good cup of coffee. Smoking, on the other hand, is an awful chemical addiction that's extremely difficult to kick due to nicotine's super powerful addictiveness. And it has a ridiculously high chance of killing you, or at least maiming your lungs and preventing you from enjoying life. Now, we're already running way over time because there's so many bad things about smoking to talk about that we're not going to have time to delve into all the various tools out there that can aid people quitting smoking now, such as nicotine replacement therapy and medications such as Zyban or bupropion. Instead, let's take a short break and then talk about vaping for a bit in the place of a 2-minute explain before we wrap up the show. Alright, so we've learned about how a lot of the damage from cigarettes is from the nasty cigarette tar and all the acrid chemicals that are produced in burning the tobacco leaves. So this made a lot of people wonder, how can we keep the desired effect of nicotine in tobacco, but get rid of the bad parts? Specifically, can we come up with a way to provide people just the nicotine so they can wean off cigarettes and overcome their addiction slowly, while drastically reducing the harmful effects of cigarette smoke? This is where nicotine replacement therapy comes from, where people chew gums, suck on lozenges, or apply a skin patch to get a hit of nicotine when they have the urge to smoke, to try to reduce and stop tobacco use completely. But the big issue of NRT is that people seem to really want the physical sensation of taking a draw and inhaling something that simulates the smoking part of smoking. So as a solution, e-cigarettes were created. These are machines that, instead of burning tobacco leaves with fire, they contain a cartridge of liquid that is mostly made of nicotine dissolved in propylene glycol and glycerin. The machine also has an electrical coil that heats up the liquid to boil it, turning it into vapor, hence why e-cigarettes are colloquially called vapes. Vapes have recently exploded in popularity in the past 10 years because as technology has improved, the machines have gotten much smaller and more efficient, making it more accessible and easy to use, especially for people trying to quit smoking. It has the positives of not having any tobacco leaves in it, nor burning it with fire, meaning that you can deliver just nicotine to people, without any tar or other nasty chemicals that cause cancer. There's also no ash or carbon monoxide produced, because it's all vaporized water. This makes it far safer than cigarettes, with some estimates putting it as 90 to 95% safer than cigarettes. Bearing in mind, of course, that cigarettes are super unsafe, so 95% reduction doesn't mean zero harm. So vaping has been very useful with people trying to quit smoking, because it's another tool to act as nicotine replacement, while giving people the psychological satisfaction of breathing in hot vapor that feels like the act of smoking. But the big problem with vaping now is that because it's been made so accessible, it's exploded in popularity with another group of people, the youths. There's an increasingly big subculture forming around vaping, with people taking it up almost as an enthusiast hobby, with people making unsanctioned modifications to e-cigarettes, and people discussing different products on internet forums. The danger of this is that even though e-cigarettes and vapes were invented mainly to help stop people smoking, paradoxically, it's being used by people who didn't smoke or had no intentions to smoke. Furthermore, tobacco companies aren't stupid, so they've been reading the room that people know that their product is bad, so they've been shifting gears into producing vapes instead. So they've been incentivized to get as many people vaping to capture profits. This means that vapes are now marketed as a cool hip thing with exciting advertising and various options such as colorful packaging and machines, various delicious sounding flavors, and so forth. Much like how cigarette advertising exploded in the 20th century to capture people who didn't smoke, such as women or doctors, by saying things like, "Look, our cigarettes have a fancy new filter that reduces the amount of tar you breathe in." Even though all the data show that things like cigarette filters, light cigarettes, and menthol cigarettes all don't really reduce the harm from smoking by any significant amount. So, back to vaping and youths. Even though rates of smoking has been falling over the past few decades, the past decade has seen a rapid rise in young people picking up vaping. What's more, although vaping has helped reduce smoking in general for young people, we're also seeing some young people move on from vaping onto full-on cigarette smoking. This is related to the gateway theory, with some evidence supporting the fact that when people start vaping, it increases their risk of going on to be actual smokers as well. So we have this tool that's supposed to help reduce smoking, but paradoxically, it's introducing smoking to young people instead. Great, it's Anakin Skywalker all over again. Now, you might say, but Jin, didn't you tell us that nicotine is mostly safe, so as long as we don't smoke, vaping should be fine, right? Well, wrong. Because for one, nicotine isn't harmless. It is still a plant toxin after all. You can still become quite unwell from nicotine overdose, which has been an increasing problem, especially when children accidentally drink the liquid in vapes, because the packaging makes it look like a yummy juice, and children put everything in their mouths. And also because people sometimes experiment with different vape liquids, some of which need to be diluted due to the high nicotine content. Secondly, vaping is still very new. We don't actually know what the long-term health consequences will be from it. Just look at how long it took humanity to realize cigarettes were harmful. 300 years before we started noticing properly, and then another 30 to 40 years before society believed the scientists and doctors and did something large-scale about it. We already know from studies that vaping certainly is not harmless. It reduces both lung function and heart muscle function, and it increases inflammation. It still has nicotine, which is super addictive, so you'll still end up addicted to vaping even if you weren't a smoker. We also know that even though nicotine doesn't cause cancer directly, it seems to be able to accelerate existing cancers by stopping the automatic cell death, the apoptosis that we mentioned. There was also a big controversy in 2019 when there were a string of deaths in people who vaped, with evidence of severe lung injury as the cause of death. E-Valley, or e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury, yeah, not a catchy name, turned out to be due to people vaping unregulated cannabis products, which contained a certain vitamin E acetate that caused the lung injuries. Even though regular vapes usually don't cause this kind of lung injury, it just highlights how little we know about this new technology and the potential harmful health effects. Same goes for glycerin and propylene glycol. We know that small quantities are safe to ingest, but we don't really know if it's harmful or not when you inhale it. Lastly, we don't know if nicotine by itself can inhibit or slow down brain development in young people, so vaping might be affecting their potential brain growth. Oh, and we didn't even talk about all the horrific accidents that happen from vape batteries exploding, causing large burns that can leave permanent disfigurement. All in all, there's absolutely no reason you should pick up vaping if you're not already a smoker trying to quit smoking. You'll only be addicted to a substance and be a slave to the tobacco industry, with the potential of lung or brain or burn injury for no real gain. Pick up a healthier addiction instead, like Magic the Gathering, or educational podcasts. So, what did we learn today? We learned that tobacco is a plant that contains a poison called nicotine, which gives people a buzz, while also being a stimulant and crazy addictive. We learned that when people burn tobacco to smoke it, it produces a sickening toxic compound called tar, which is full of chemicals that can cause cancer and organ damage. We learned that smoking causes lung cancer because these chemicals and radioactive particles in cigarette smoke damage lung cell DNA, causing it to grow wildly out of control. We learned that smoking can also cause COPD, a horrible, irreversible lung condition where the lungs are clogged full of mucus and can't breathe properly due to not being elastic anymore. We also learned about all the other bad effects of smoking, such as blood vessel damage causing heart attacks and strokes and erectile dysfunction. We learned about what vaping is, and how it might not be as harmless as we think. Lastly, I hope you learned that smoking is really, really bad, and there's a ton of science and evidence to back this up, so don't even think about starting it. And if you smoke, please, 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 for the love of doctors everywhere, give it up. We need those hospital beds, and we'd prefer you not dying horribly from a preventable illness. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Explain This. I hope you've learned something interesting and maybe even useful today. If you know someone who smokes who wants more information and motivation to quit, or people who want to learn more about the evils of tobacco to convince people away from it, please share the episode widely and spread the information. We'll see you next time. Bye for now. Explain This was written and hosted by me, Jin Kim. If you'd like to suggest a topic or just send a lovely message, you can email me at explainthiscast@gmail.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter.